All right, what's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesforsythe.com. And how exactly, or what we're going to discuss today is basically how exactly your story, like who you are, the problems you face, and things like that, are going to kind of affect the design for a potential CBDC, right? A central bank digital currency, right? And part of this is because we've been talking about kind of user adoption in general and like strategies that the central banks themselves have been discussing, um, coming sourced straight from discussion papers from them, from literally a group of central banks, um, which would include like the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. They're, I guess, co-authors for this series of papers. And then there's also the Bank of Japan, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, and a few other ones. And then it's all posted on the BIS website. Um, for that, and before I get too down a far of a rabbit hole, we're going to go to the actual source itself. And 1 second, I'll make this bigger so hopefully you guys can see it as well. Okay, so kind of talking on the system itself, just in case you haven't been watching some of the other videos. So the CBD system would require some capital investment. Obviously, who's going to provide that capital? Who's going to take up those kind of, I guess, costs of operation? Um, that's something that we've discussed, I believe, in the previous video. Um, so this would include costs of the central bank to set up the core system, as well as some costs borne by the private sector to interoperate and provide services on top of the core system, right? And so we have like 2 or 3 videos on interoperability throughout the playlist that'll be linked in the description and at the end of the video, just so you can see, just putting all of the central bank digital currency stuff in the same place so you can see it if you need. So this is where it kind of gets into you, right? So designing a CBDC would require a detailed understanding of the future needs of and alternative payment options available to users in various segments of the population. And so one of the things, I guess, main selling points per se for a CBDC is basically financial inclusion. That's one of the things that they use. They also talk about government fiscal transfer payments a little bit as well, kind of setting that aside for the moment, but really getting on the inclusion part. And they're really, what they do and by what they mean by various segments of the population is they basically fragment uh, the kind of society in a way, um, in order to do what they call create market segments, basically where each one has a specific use case and they're looking at different user stories, which will kind of break down into a story by story basis in a few minutes, right? And so developing this knowledge of the different market segments may be achieved via surveys and more precise design work with target customers. And so, like when they initially put out these discussion papers and such, they did talk about having they had a group of stakeholders, who basically they discussed this with and asked feedback and things like that. And I don't remember, the last time I checked, they did not give a date on which their feedback will actually be published. It could already be out and they just didn't do like a regular announcement, or just haven't found it on government websites, because those can be a rabbit hole in and of themselves. Um, so to continue, as specific user needs evolve, a CBDC would need to adapt to meet them. A flexible and extensible core CBDC system would enable innovators to identify and offer new services to meet those future needs, right? And so basically, a CBDC needs to be flexible, right? And that's one of the main talking points for having a central bank digital currency is basically, especially from a United States perspective, is the Fed specifically has talked about how having and implementing a central bank digital currency would basically ensure or help ensure the dollar from losing, would help prevent the dollar from losing reserve currency status, basically keeping them on the kind of the front edge, or the front edge of all of these developments in the financial system, right? Where you have other places like China and I think the Bahamas, if I remember correctly, that are kind of implementing some form of actual pilot program for central bank digital currencies, right? So you have the digital yuan, and I think it's the Bahamian sand dollar, if I remember correctly. That part's rather vague in terms of, obviously I don't remember exactly what it is, um, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I think that may be a topic of a future video whenever I go over that source as well, right? And so basically how they do this is they're breaking it up into different market segments. And so the different segments themselves could be potentially relevant for CBDCs are, for example, domestic retail payments, cross-border payments, and fiscal transfers. So basically they're kind of taking the market in general and breaking it up into different use cases that would have to have a different maybe not have to, but it would be beneficial for them if a central bank digital currency was tailored to their specific needs, right? They have different needs for each one of these segments, right? And so basically what they're trying to do is break down different user stories, as they put them, or personas that would basically help them fine tune a central bank digital currency to go to best attack all of them at the same time without too much cost, at least relative to the benefit for each segment itself, right? And so these market segments might encompass a large variety of payment use cases, and basically like paying a friend to split the bill at a restaurant, a small merchant paying staff wages, and a welfare payment from the government, or an international remittance. So these latter two, especially, we've talked a little bit more in depth, specifically with like UBI, fiscal transfer payments, and also the remittance payments, how that relates to cross-border payments in general, right? So we've talked a little bit more about that in previous videos. Again, it'll all be in that playlist. So basically a persona is how they're defining it, is a larger customer segment, right, of that market. And so the frictions, needs, and considerations and priorities of one segment could markedly differ to those of other markets. And that's part of the reason why they're breaking it up into different personas or different user stories, right? And so basically what they're defining a user story as is kind of the narrative for a particular user, as they say, which is what's describing the individual personas, right? And so we're talking about things like, okay, what does this kind of generalized user story, what is their pain point, to use their own words? What do they need help with? What need is not being fulfilled by traditional finance? And then how could a CBDC fulfill that need? What is that motivation to implement a CBDC? And then also, what kind of design concept specific to that need for that individual person, or for that use case, we'll say, or I guess user story, to basically help adoption of the central bank digital currency? What would make it easiest for it to actually be used for that, right? So they break this down into 6 different stories, right? So you kind of have a well-connected consumers, who they're saying like a consumer with a bank account and several options for digital payment. So this is someone who's, I wouldn't even say like middle class. I'd say more like anyone who has a bank account. So that would even go into more, I guess, lower class or whatever, however you want to talk about it. Not extremely impoverished, right? Who would be able to pay like with a check or with some other form of digital commercial bank liabilities. So they have commercial bank deposits at a bank, and then they can do transactions off of that, right? And so they say that kind of the use case or the motivation for a CBDC in that case would be a highly interoperable CBDC. Basically, you could use it interchangeably with pretty much anywhere in the system you would want, whether or not that CBDC system runs parallel to traditional finance or not, and how interoperable, how well those systems can operate together or connect in general, right? And so the design concept that they kind of bring from that is enhanced interoperability and privacy features, offline functionality, and new features. Example would be programmable payments, which is kind of like the micro payments we talked about before, basically having, instead of you paying, say, your electric bill at the end of every month or whatever your pay period is, it would be almost a continuous withdrawal depending on how much you're using. So it'd be like a rate per minute or whatever, however they want to define it, per hour, per day, same thing, relatively, I guess, in concept. And so basically, and they would just withdraw at that rate, right? And so it'd be more continuous. Okay, so for another user story, a user with no or limited internet, someone who doesn't have internet. So they would be on a limited budget and who lives in a remote region without reliable internet. I'm assuming basically they're they're assuming that the reason they don't have internet is because they can't pay for it, or they live somewhere out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't have it, right? And so, kind of the CBDC motivation for that would be a low cost, free payment method with offline capacity. This is one thing that basically having. This is one thing that they've talked about for central bank digital currencies in general, is having a offline mode of payment to where it's very much like a peer-to-peer thing. That's also kind of I guess they define this as by implementing the CBDC via a one-sided market, right, towards peer-to-peer instead of like merchant and customer, right? Because there's a problem between merchant and customer where the merchants don't want to accept it if not if a, if not sorry if an inadequate amount of consumers will use it, right? Because then they have to adopt a new POS system or somehow integrate it into their POS system and so on. And then basically that could be a pain and might not be beneficial for the merchant. But on the other hand, the consumer doesn't want to have to learn how to use it, they don't want to they don't want to have some part of their wealth denominated in something they can't even spend, right? On the other hand. And so basically, they've talked about having a peer to peer, which would essentially be kind of a more offline capacity in a way. They're not exactly, they're related, but not the same thing, right? And that would be helpful. So basically, a CBDC with a universal access device, as they put it, with both online and offline functionality. Basically, what technology would be used specifically for said CBDC. So there's that, and that could be like a flash drive. It could be like a card that you tap or something. Maybe a little kind of flash drive with a screen, something that you could use. I think there's something called a taser or whatever for crypto. Might be pronounced different. I don't remember. Something along those lines. Okay, so for another user story, you have unbanked people. So basically, consumers who don't have or do not have the desire to have a bank account, right? And so basically, a CBDC can be used to make digital payments without even having a bank account. And so for me, I never really understood why certain people were unbanked or whatever. And by certain people, I'm not like saying a specific person. I'm just breaking it down into the people who are unbanked who have no desire to be, right, to be banked, right? And so didn't articulate that the best, but it was the desire part that really kind of, I guess, put the light bulb for me, is because I was like, I mean, it's not that difficult to get a bank account relatively, unless for wherever they happen to be, for some reason, the only banks they have like access to are have stupid requirements or whatever. I think for me to set up mine, I had to have like $5 in the savings account or something, and then I could do whatever. And then the checking, it could be whatever, right? And then you basically just have to do certain things. That may have changed because I set it up quite a few years ago, so could be different. I don't know, but that's just from it's more anecdotal evidence in general. Um, could be. But anyways, for me, it was the desire. I understand more not having a desire to own a bank account, but it's also like if they don't have the desire to have a bank account with respect or because they understand like counterparty risk with the commercial banks, then and they, for them personally, whatever their kind of personal risk reward situation is, deem that to be too risky for them, fair enough. But it's also that type of person would probably understand this stuff enough to where they probably don't want a CBDC either. But that's a different topic. But anyways, there's that. And basically, just for unbanked people, it's kind of similar, or the design part of it would be similar to the user with no or limited internet, right? They wouldn't be able to use it, don't have to use banks, whatever, right? And then there's the people with accessibility needs. So basically, people who are deaf, blind, have some other form of disability or whatever to where they can't use it in a typical sense, right? That maybe they're blind and can't literally sit there and type whatever it may be, right? So maybe they have a version of the flash drive or whatever in Braille. I don't know. They didn't give specific examples on how to remedy this. They're just saying this could help it, and okay, but how? So that's just an idea that comes to mind. But so basically, they say a central bank digital currency could be an accessible means of payment. And so a single purpose payment device with large fonts and haptic feedback would be one way to do it. I guess that answers that question um, to a certain degree. I mean, if they're completely blind, I guess that's what the haptic feedback's for. So a user that prioritizes privacy, right? And so privacy is a very large part of a central bank digital currency, as in like that's a very large argument against it on why people are hesitant, right? Which who could blame them? And part of this, their argument for this isn't the best, in my opinion. It's kind of like, oh, central bank money is the safest form, and then we can just define who has access to all the information. And it's like, okay, but you don't give specific guidelines on how that's going to be defined, right? And without that, you can't really make a value judgment on that aspect of it, right? But anyways, to continue, so a consumer who does not want commercial banks to know his or her identity or track his or her spending. So here they're kind of pushing off the information on the commercial banks, which to me doesn't make sense because I think it would be more along the lines of people don't want the government to know his or her identity and track his or her spending. So it's kind of like cherry picking information or kind of throwing a skew on it, or however you want to view it, in order to kind of shed this in a positive light, right? From this specific perspective. And so basically, again, they say how to do this would be or how to remedy this would be a universal access device, and then unregistered wallet at a money service business. So basically having some form of anonymity, right? Or however the hell you pronounce it. Basically being anonymous. But they also put that with a caveat on with limits for compliance, because they have to be compliant to anti-money laundering laws, and then not funding terrorism and things like that. So there's that, but also limits on either total amount or on the kind of inflow or outflow of currency in general has been talked about rather extensively. I don't want to say extensively, but it's been talked about to an adequate degree, I'll say, to where there seems to be, how to word it, if a CBDC were to come, it would most likely be that happens, basically, assuming from how it's talked about in the discussion papers themselves. That part is shed in a positive light, right? So there's that. And then kind of the final use case is a small merchant at a POS system. So basically stores and retailers being able to actually sell stuff like at the cash register or whatever, right? How would you integrate it with that? So it'd be any retailer who wants to accept a CBDC. And then it would be a way of accepting non-cash payments that is cheaper and more flexible than current solutions. And then a CBDC designed with low onboarding costs that does not depend on existing costly point of sale hardware, right? And so I don't remember, or I've never personally had to like operate the business from that perspective. from some of the work that I have done, I mean, I've had to operate point of sale system in general. And I know that can be a pain and it can be rather costly depending on the business model, at least relatively. Um, but without having like actual data on and specific numbers on that, I can't make a value judgment on it in general. But that's another thing that they talk about, right? So that's it for this section. So yeah, major takeaways. Basically, a CBDC would be designed to try to incorporate as many different kind of use cases in general for all of these. And so one of the things is, if you notice with each individual story, there's kind of different features that would be beneficial. And so it's kind of them trying to figure out how to define or fine tune each feature to optimize it. I guess. I guess that's the right word, optimize it for each individual case on aggregate total, right? So how can you hit all 6 of these categories in the best way without taking too much from one or putting too much in the other, right? Because you don't want to. And on the other hand, still not disrupting traditional finance or the traditional financial system with commercial banks and all of the kind of more private money in general, right? So, with that being said, I'm going to leave that here. So, I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you.